Welcome to DIA Today, Democracy in America Today. I'm Matt Parks alongside David Corbin. Glad to have you with us as we explore the ideas behind today's headlines.
My left eye sees pollution. Those dirty fuels are burning. The earth's whole climate's churning. Clean energy solution. My right eye scans the bill. Fossil fuels are cheap. Wind and solar too steep. Drill, baby, drill. Predefined, misaligned, polarized division. Shuttered mind, worse than blind. 2020 vision.
How's it going, Dave?
Going well, Matt. We're into January. Hard to believe it's February right around the corner.
Yeah.
Finally got some snow in Colorado, so we went skiing yesterday.
Oh, nice.
And it looks like winter out here, whereas we've had this really mild winter. So
Yeah.
it sounds crazy, but looking forward to more snow in February and March.
Very good. Yeah, here we are not in search of winter. We have it right in front of us. So we got 15 to 18 inches of snow last weekend. It has been no more than about 15 degrees each day this week, and more of that to come. So I'm kind of ready for 35 and a little bit of sun. The kids have enjoyed the snow for sure. I don't think they're old enough to remember the last time we had that much in general. So, they were out there. And we've got a little bit of property here, so there was some good sledding and had some friends over and that kind of stuff. So that's all been good. But it's funny, I mean, with that much snow, even the big kids, you're trying to walk through it, take 2 steps, you fall over because you can't lift your legs up high enough. So
You have a snow blower, or you just did everything by hand?
no, it was shoveling. So I estimated about 6 hours to clear the driveway, which is it's kind of a big oval, and so the problem with that is at certain points you're a long way from where you're dumping the snow. So there's a lot of grab a scoop, walk 10 steps, dump, come back. But good exercise for sure. But
Ready-made for a chiropractor to come in and work on
right.
your back? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't as sore or as tired as I thought I would be. I guess I was pacing myself, and my son was helping as well, and the girls a little bit too. So, yeah, I mean, given all the circumstances, it could have been worse. It's very dry snow, so it's not super heavy, so that was helpful as well.
Nice. Good. Well, winter has arrived.
Yeah.
And for you, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. No, very pretty here. That's no doubt about that. But also arriving, a new series for us. So we gave a little bit of a preview last time. We're going to spend next several months working our way to July 4th, 2026, the semi-quincentennial of our nation, the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And so what we thought we would do in a series of probably 12 podcasts, Lord willing, if we go every other week as we plan to, is to work through some of the key documents, speeches, public statements of the period leading up to 1776, and just kind of talk through that revolutionary era, its principles and ideals, and make application of those to our present day. So this is kind of our bread and butter, going back to our old APTAP 1 days. And we're going to start today with the very first really gathering of the colonies in order to respond to a general sense of alarm. 1765, the Stamp Act Congress. So just give a little bit of background there. If you go back to your colonial history, you might recall that the French and Indian War was kind of the American theater of what was called the 7 Years' War in Europe, which ran from 1756 to 1763. And British and American colonies fought side by side in North America very successfully. And at the end of that war, the French were more or less kicked out of the Americas. They had a small redoubt in what's today Haiti, but otherwise Quebec was lost. They had a major series of fortifications, kind of near the Mississippi River, further west in the American colonies. All those were lost. And the Indian tribes that had allied with them were at least relatively quieted by the action. So it was a big win for the American colonists and for the British. And Americans looked forward to the years to come of being good members of the British Empire, thought they had done good work supporting the empire, and hoped to get the benefits from that. And much to their surprise, almost as soon as the war ended, the British Crown declared that there would be a line, just a map line, but a line, at least in the British mind, that was real, that would prevent the American colonists from going further west. So, you had sort of more or less a line that would run through, let's say, western Pennsylvania today and kind of up and down the East Coast. That was going to be the furthest reaches of the British colonies in North America. And the idea was to avoid provoking those Indian tribes that had allied with the French and to allow Americans to develop further in that East Coast area. Well, you can see the strategic benefits of that from the British standpoint, but the Americans, this is what they fought for, was more land. A growing population, the American population was doubling every 25 to 30 years from the early colonial days all the way past the Civil War. So really extraordinary population growth. And at a time when there was no industrialized economy, no factories, there was agriculture, you needed land. And second and third and fourth sons needed property. And that was going to be further west. And so the idea of drawing a line that wouldn't be passed was very much contrary to the hopes, expectations, and interests of the American colonists. So that's kind of strike one from the perspective of the American colonists coming out of this great collaboration and victory in the French Indian War. Strike two is the British thought, well, we've got a lot of war debt here, and the Americans benefited quite a bit from this war. And so why shouldn't they pay some of that? And so a series of laws that were passed to tax the American colonists really for the first time. We'll talk about one of those further in the context of the Stamp Act Congress. But this too raises serious questions, not just about taxation, which are always serious questions, but also about the Constitution, because this was now that distant British Parliament taxing these American colonists who had their own colonial assemblies that had taxed them and more or less been their representative body for, in some cases, 150 years by this point. So, although the victory in the French Indian War was a great high point, you might say, of English and American collaboration, things very quickly degenerated. And that's kind of the context for our discussion of the Declaration of Rights by the Stamp Act Congress today.
Yeah, I think what we're trying to do with this episode is not only give some historical context for the political development that ends in the Declaration of Independence, but also kind of some general themes that make their way throughout American history. And one is, okay, when something bad happens to you, how do you respond to that in a way that is respectful of the governing authorities? And I think you see this respect, Matt, in the actual Declaration of Rights that are presented to the king. So let's go through these Declaration of Rights. I want to start with the preamble of the Declaration. Just the first sentence, you'll get a sense of the sentiment. There's a respectful sentiment present within this declaration. It's not a rebellious, right? We're going to rebel at any cost. First sentence, the members of this Congress, sincerely devoted, with the warmest sentiments of affection and duty to His Majesty's person and government, inviolably attached to the present happy establishment of the Protestant succession, and with minds deeply impressed by a sense of the present and impending misfortunes of the British colonies on this continent, have considered as maturely as time would permit the circumstances of said colonies. So you see in that sentence that there's a great respect that these colonists view themselves as British. They're part of right the British Empire. In the first declaration, they write that His Majesty's subjects in these colonies owe the same allegiance to the Crown of Great Britain that is owing from his subjects born within the realm, and all due subordination to that august body, the Parliament of Great Britain. Now, you noted here, Matt, that they owe an allegiance to the Crown of Great Britain and all due subordination to the Parliament. Why is that important, those different ways of characterizing what is owed?
That's going to be the nub of the issue here, really, as we move forward and all the way up until 1776, because until the Declaration of Independence, literally, the American colonists had always recognized that the king was their king. and been relatively pleased to have the king as their king. What they had challenged was the right of the parliament to tax them. And so, in the context of the Stamp Act, this was a law that was passed in 1765 that basically required that public acts be registered on paper that had a certain stamp on it. So it's not like buying postage stamps, but like a stamp you would impress upon a piece of paper or playing cards or whatever. And so yeah, that came with a premium price that was then a portion that returned back to the British Crown. And so the American colonists believed, as we'll see as we develop the argument here, that while the Parliament was one of the legislative bodies for the British Empire, it was not the exclusive or supreme one, and that their primary legislative body through which they were represented and that had the power to tax them, etc., was their local assembly in Massachusetts or Pennsylvania or Virginia, etc.
So a governance structure in which there is a king and there are subjects, but there are different organizations that are legislative in their function beneath that king. So you see this come up in the second right declared that His Majesty's liege subjects in these colonies are entitled to all the inherent rights and privileges of his natural born subjects within the Kingdom of Great Britain. So there you see the language of subject, king and subject in Britain, king and subject in the American colonies. However, this recognition that while subject to the king, they also have their representative bodies in the places they live.
And they're equal to those subjects that are back in England. This was a critically important point. You know, we think about oftentimes colonialism as coming with a subordination on the part of those who are in the colony. And that's obviously the model that was used around the world, especially in the 19th century. That was not the situation here. From the earliest days, the earliest charters establishing colonies in the Americas, they explicitly protected the rights of the colonists. If you were leaving Britain and going to America, you weren't becoming a second-class member of the British Empire. And so therefore, what they're saying is, and they're really getting ready to invoke some specifics going back to previous declarations of right, the English Bill of Rights, etc. They're saying, look, whatever those rights are that are in general reserved for the people of Britain, they're reserved for us too.
Yeah, and the key word here, right, as you get into the third declaration, that it is inseparably essential to the freedom of the people and the undoubted rights of Englishmen that no taxes should be imposed on them, but with their own consent, given personally or by their representatives. And as you've noted, Matt, the Americans believe they had representatives that were in the colonies themselves. So as long as you consent or you've consented to your representative and a tax has been passed, that's one thing. But if it's a body that is not representing you, then that's the very definition of an act, whether it's taxation or anything else, without representation.
Yeah, exactly. And this principle goes all the way back to Magna Carta. So we're talking about 400, 500-year-old principle at this point. And the English Bill of Rights, it said explicitly that taxes could not be imposed upon people without the consent of Parliament. Now, here's where the difference comes in, because the British Crown read that as, yeah, Parliament, right? So as long as Parliament asserts the tax and passes the law taxing the people, then it's okay. And that's true for the American colonists as well. The Americans read that and said, no, that's not the idea. The underlying principle is that it's your local assembly, it's your representative assembly that taxes you. And so whereas that's true of Parliament if you're back in England, that's, again, Massachusetts Assembly if you're in Massachusetts. That's the Virginia House of Burgesses if you're in Virginia. So this is a fundamental difference of interpretation of what the underlying principle was. Americans say no taxation without representation. The British say, well, what we really mean is no taxation without Parliament stepping in, whether you're truly represented there or not.
Yeah, and that gets to the fourth and fifth declarations that the people of the colonies did not have representation within the House of Commons in Great Britain. Yet they did, in the fifth declaration, have representatives, as you just said, within the colonies themselves. So if you don't have representation, you don't really have a say to how you're governed. And I mean, you're really getting to a point where you're giving up everything. You are not simply subject to a king, you're subject to the whims of whatever the British Parliament wants at that place and time.
Yeah, and it's important to recognize that they were not asking for seats in parliament. That's usually how people think about it. Well, okay, we don't have seats in parliament. Let's give Americans, an appropriate percentage of the seats in parliament. They'll be happy then. Well, no, they're saying we can't be represented there. There's no way, given the transportation and communication limits of that day, you can truly represent somebody 3,000 miles away over there in England. And we have evidence of this from the time because Ben Franklin was over there representing the American colonies, certain colonies, and he missed it. He thought the Stamp Act was okay. He recommended a friend become a Stamp Act tax collector, and that friend did not thank him for it because that was not a popular decision. So, Ben Franklin, right? Noble Ben Franklin, wise Ben Franklin, patriotic Ben Franklin doesn't have his finger on the pulse of the American colonies. He couldn't possibly from 3,000 miles away. And so this is just more evidence of what they were saying all along was it has to be local representation who really knows the people, lives among the people for it to be true representation.
So, Matt, is this a situation, because this comes up in the sixth declaration, that the American colonists did not want to give anything to the crown, any monies or whatsoever, or is it something, is it this about money?
No, that's a great question. And I think we often, maybe cynically, think that that's the case. The taxes that were imposed were relatively small, and people can sort of laugh at it. "Oh, boy, I'd take those taxes, right? Given what we're taxed today. Should we have another rebellion? Well, it wasn't about taxes because it was about control. And in fact, they had granted and were willing to grant funds to the crown. That was a traditional thing. And when we get further on in this discussion, we'll get to Edmund Burke and his proposal that, yeah, let the colonies voluntarily give money to support the crown when it's appropriate. That was an age-old English tradition, but that was not something that was being contemplated here. They were being required to pay these taxes without having any say. And that was for them the nub of the issue.
Yeah, taxes are gifts to the crown from the people, but you can't give someone else's money as a gift. That's kind of
Right.
an imposition, not a gift.
Exactly.
So as you move forward through the 7th through 12th declarations, you see some things that will pop up in the Declaration of Independence itself. That trial by jury is the inherent and invaluable right of every British subject. That the late Act of Parliament, number 8, entitled An Act for Granting and Applying Certain Stamp Duties and Other Duties in the British colonies and plantations in America, etc., by imposing taxes on the inhabitants of these colonies, and the said act and several other acts by extending the jurisdiction of the courts has gone too far. Number 9, that the duties imposed by the several late acts of Parliament from the peculiar circumstances of these colonies will be extremely burthensome and grievous. So this language here is a language in which, going back to that principle, that if you're giving away someone else's money, if you're giving away someone else's rights, then something unjust is happening in this situation.
Exactly. And so this would be the first of a number of efforts they would make to ask for repeal of particular laws and to call upon the conscience of the parliament, the conscience of the king, and say, look, we want to be loyal subjects here. We see this empire, at least at this point, as central to our happiness. But it has to be on terms that allow us to look forward to the extension of that happiness and allow us to live under the principles that we've become accustomed to and in a way that suits us as true equal British subjects.
Right, and you see that sentiment in Declarations 10 through 12 that we're part of this great empire, and you can benefit and we can benefit from trade, and we want that benefit from trade, and we want not only to increase our own prosperity and happiness, but also the prosperity and happiness of the British realm. So these things
Right.
needn't be in opposition. It's not a zero-sum game, but in order for that to work, there have to be rail guards in place and an understanding of basic principles of governance in place. And we've stated them here. And then, so then in the 13th declaration, that we're now petitioning you peacefully to hear our appeal. There's nothing inherently in the whole document that strikes as rebellious or insubordinate to the king.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this assembly was irregular in the sense it didn't previously exist. You had 9 of the colonies that sent delegates. 6 had the authority to vote on something. So it wasn't all 13 colonies, and they didn't all have a chance to get behind this. But here you have people that are trying to be duly representative under the British tradition, who are trying to speak in a very calm and reverential, you might even say, way to the king in particular, who are citing British precedent, who are talking about their long-standing obligations that have been taken on by the government and the rights that have been given to the people. So all of this is deeply embedded in the English tradition, and they're just essentially saying, treat us as you've pledged to treat us. Continue to interact with us the way that we've interacted with you for the last 150 years, and all will be well.
Yes, this language of being dutiful to the king, country, but also that there's a duty and there are rights that go back and forth. This, as you said, has been part of English, common law from the beginning. So what happens afterwards, man? They share these Declaration of Rights, and what's the response from the British?
Well, it's interesting because on the one hand, they win. The colonists win. The Stamp Act in particular is repealed. And so that particular assault on their rights, on their pocketbooks, is resolved in a way that they would be happy with. But at the same time, the Parliament passes what's called the Declaratory Act, which asserts that they have the right to legislate for the colonies in all matters whatsoever. Now, at the time, the American colonists were celebrating their win in the repeal of the Stamp Act, and they more or less let that go. Some of the more far-sighted see this as a potential problem down the road, but it's a problem for another day. And so declare victory, go home. We'll see when we get to the Declaration of Independence, that language appears again. And looking back on it, they recognize that as essentially a statement of a tyrannical, ultimately, authority over the American colonies and to denial of their rights to be represented at the local level. So more to say about that, but for the time being, the American colonists are satisfied with the repeal of the Stamp Act.
So the expression that we always hear, the mantra that comes out of this part of our study of American history is no taxation without representation. But we've got to be mindful that there's a larger principle at play here, which is no governance without just representation. So it's
Hmm.
more than just taxes. It
Right.
involves everything. No governance without just representation.
And taxation, of course, is central to this because it's an assault on property. And when we think about the fundamental rights, what's it take to actually live a decent life? You have to be secure in your property. And so people can't be arbitrarily taking away from you the bread that your hand has earned and the property that you've been able to accumulate by your efforts. But you're right. All governance in some way or another relates back to those basic and fundamental rights and liberties. And so to live under an arbitrary government that has no accountability to the people is a very difficult thing.
Well, let's move to the present day then, and so we hear there are a lot of you think back to what was happening 15, 20 years ago, critiques of the federal government and all the rest, and you hear this call, no taxation without representation. I think there's a pretty clear parallel between what was happening back then and what is happening today with the outgrowth of the American federal government and the feeling among Americans that they really have no representation. I mean, they formally they have representation, right? We
Right.
go and vote for people, and they then go to Washington, D.C. But at the end of the day, do we actually govern ourselves? Are we a self-governing people, or do you just have the facade
Hmm.
of self-governance? There was an author about 20 years ago who wrote a book called Demosclerosis, Jonathan Rauch, who said that, yeah, you vote for elected representatives, but they then go to Washington, D.C. They then are most intimately involved with special interest groups who craft out budgets that work for the benefit of insiders. But they're really not, after they get elected, doing the things that tend toward the common good. And we've seen kind of populist backlash against this over years. But is this a good parallel, Matt? This notion of demosclerosis in our present day that yeah, it's a democracy, but yeah, it's not really democratic.
Well, I think that's certainly one of the things that plays into our populist moment, the sense that, yeah, you can vote for whomever you like, but not much is going to change. I mean, think about discussions over budgeting and efforts to get the deficit under control. And you talk about things like, well, how much discretionary spending actually is there in the budget? Well, shouldn't it be all discretionary? I mean, shouldn't the Congress be able to do as it pleases in setting a budget. And in some abstract sense, it can. But you think about large parts of the budget, starting with obviously interest on the debt, but then you've got entitlements, right? I mean, these things are baked in. I mean, that those things are set and they're on autopilot. That spending is going to happen whether you've got R's or D's or whomever in charge. And so when you think about what's left, and we often have this outsized view, well, if we just cut 4 and 8, we could balance the budget. Good luck. That's a small part of the budget. But there's a lot that we sort of take for granted as just this is just how it has to be. So what are we actually debating over? I remember us writing an essay maybe 10 years ago in the Obama years, and the difference between the Republican budget and the Democratic budget was like 2%. It was a tiny part of it that was really on the table. And so if you were interested in doing more fundamental things, that was simply not a possibility. Now, some of that may be right. We don't want to just overnight end Social Security and leave everybody to figure out what they're going to do after that. But the idea that our government is less responsive than it ought to be to democratic pressure, to the rise and fall of party programs, et cetera, is something that's been around for a while, and I think is a fair application of the principal concern that we're talking about here back in the revolutionary period.
Yeah, and it's almost laughable to even use the language of budgets because it's not like families drawing up their budgets, right? In fact, what do you have? One continuing spending resolution after
Oh yeah,
another, after another, after another.
right.
These are temporary spending bills. They're not budgets.
Yeah,
And so it's always understood, right, that the money's going to be there, but you have no say as to how much. And like you said, it's not all discretionary, and it should be.
right,
Everything, every item should be discretionary.
right. I remember back as the 90s, the idea of zero-based budgeting, right? And justify every dollar, right? Rather than saying, well, are we going to go up or down from where we are now? Let's talk about the very first dollar. We're going to spend anything on this program. But
Exactly.
that was one of those ideas that I think John Kasich back in the day was pushing back in the House, but never really took hold. Maybe Phil Gramm was on that train as well. There were a few voices in the wilderness, but yeah, I mean, we recognize that most of what happens at the federal level is very distantly removed from what happens locally and very difficult to control by any reasonable political efforts that we might make even over a series of elections.
Right. And if the spigot is always on, the taxes are always set, the money's always coming. It's
Right.
just so it's hard to turn the faucet off, right? It's you're in that situation where the money's going to get there. Well, let's look at another issue that comes up as well. We pass federal laws. We have administrative agencies within the federal government, and these agencies are called to put into place the laws that are passed. But oftentimes we see administrative rules added to these laws and administrative fees added to these
Hmm.
laws that likewise were never voted upon by the American people. And the argument is that, well, of course, in carrying out an administrative duty, it's going to come at a cost, and we're going to need discretion to be able to do that. But once again, you're seeing a distance between the elected representative, the citizen, and then the administrative body that's carrying out the law.
For sure, and that's been a problem with a number of these big regulatory bills that have been passed over the years, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, these kind of things. Big frameworks, goals, and ideals, but not a lot of details. And so the agencies like the EPA have been left to interpret, and of course that interpretation will change with administration as new one comes in, new ideas come forward. And so the law is not as stable as the law is meant to be. And one of the ideas of the rule of law is you know what the law is yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And there's a process that changes it in an orderly way. And so okay, now that there's a new law, I better adjust my operations to that. But it shouldn't be that just tomorrow, all of a sudden, some significant change takes place, that now you have to change how you do your business or how you manage your household finances. Those kind of things are meant to be protected against by the principle of the rule of law.
So we've spoken about demosclerosis, we've spoken about administrative agencies that are out of control, but uh, where's the rubber hit the road? Well, you mentioned the environment, for example, but also you think of education policy. The federal monies that are spent by the Department of Education, it's not a great amount, but its dictates over education policy broadly in this one size fits all public school system has really limited the ability of American citizens and families and parents to have a meaningful voice in how their sons and daughters are educated. So you think of the school choice movement right now, the argument is um, we are being taxed without representation for an educational system that we don't agree with. And it's really difficult and hard for a family's budget to get around those dictates that take place, that this one size fits all public school system that has become more and more secular, that has become more and more progressive. And if you want to opt out of that, you still have to pay your taxes, but then
Right.
you then thereafter have to pay for the education of your children the way that you see fit. So I think this is, we really see that there is an immediate impact upon our lives from these two modern facets of demosclerosis and administrative overreach. Real quickly, Matt, at the end, when you talk about taxation without representation, people on the left would say, well, what about the District of Columbia? What do you make of that example? So here you have people in the district. Do they have representation? Is it right representation? Is it a fair argument to make that the DC should be a state because it doesn't actually have representation?
Well, I think we have to say that the founders understood the challenges of this principle and created DC as specifically not to be part of any state. Right? The idea was you don't want the seat of government to be controlled by a state, and to have that state authority challenging the federal authority for supremacy. I think we've seen examples historically, and even in our own day, perhaps, where that could be a problem. Right? What if Minnesota was Washington D.C. right now? Would Minnesota be cooperating with the federal government? Would that create issues? That's the kind of thing they were worried about. So I think there's a problem that you can solve in a number of ways. It's a fair complaint. And now, not many people actually live in D.C. I mean, it's a decent sized city, but most of the population is in the surrounding suburbs. It doesn't have to be as large as it is. Some of those areas are just neighborhoods. Those could be part of Virginia or Maryland, right? You could have a really small area that's just the government seat. That's the essential part of Washington, D.C. So there's some ways you could make it so that people who were otherwise unrepresented in the way that they would be if they were part of Virginia or Maryland could have that kind of protection. But giving up on the idea of having a district set apart from any of the state, I think is a mistake.
Yeah, so we talked about modern applications. I think, this application, there's always a question about the governance structure and whether there's actual representation involved in our democratic republic. But what about the structure of our hearts when we want to rebel? This is not simply an application for our time, it's an application for all time. So we as Christians, when we read Paul's letter to the Romans, Romans 13, he writes, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. So if we go back to the colonists' response to the Stamp Act in 1765, what are we called upon as Christians to do when we see something that's unjust? How do we respond to that perceived injustice? What's a good way to do that? What's a way that's not in alignment with that, Matt? How would you take on that question?
Yeah, that's a great question because, I mean, the reality is we talked about the Stamp Act Congress, which was, this formal body that came together. It was very respectful in the language that it used toward the king. There's also the days of the Sons of Liberty, though. And if you were somebody who got on the wrong side of the Sons of Liberty, you might be tarred and feathered. You might have your house burned down. I mean, there were plenty of acts of violence that were associated with resistance to the Stamp Act as well. So it wasn't just a peaceful assembly sending off petitions. And obviously, we see that in our own day. I think there's a lot we can talk about here. There's obviously application to what's been going on in Minnesota with ICE and enforcement of immigration. I think we should talk about that a bit. But what Romans 13 is saying is you have a presumption of a responsibility to submit. I mean, you have to recognize Paul's writing that when Nero was emperor, and Peter's writing something similar in First Peter chapter 2, likewise, when Nero was emperor. And probably when Nero was starting to become Nero, right? The Nero we know. So it's not like we're talking about, hey, we have these great governments, submit to those great governments because they're great. This is a principle that's meant to apply, broadly speaking, as a general orientation of Christians toward government. So this is something we'll have to come back to over and over again, frankly, throughout this series, because we're going to see, obviously, many people that call themselves Christians, who were genuine Christians, who are resisting government authority. How are they doing that? Are they doing that rightfully? Is the whole movement questionable on these terms? So I think we're going to have a chance to talk through that as we go through these different documents and think about as Christians what can we endorse, what can't we endorse about the strategies, methods, and ultimate goals of the revolutionary movement.
Yeah, certainly it becomes central in American history. You think about the American Civil War, you think of protest movements in Vietnam, you think of the civil rights movement, King's letter from a Birmingham jail. These are questions that we always have to ask. So let's kind of segue to the issue of the organized resistance or opposition, obstruction, whatever you want to call it, to ICE efforts, not simply in Minnesota, that could be around the country. What would be an argument supporting an opposition or obstruction to ICE enforcement? Could you make a case for the obstructionists based upon Stamp Act resistance?
Well, I mean, let's put it in the worst possible light, if you will, the enforcement acts. So here we have local law enforcement being set aside for kind of the federal Bigfoot coming in. We've seen all the cop shows, right, where you have the turf wars and this kind of thing, where the federal agent kind of comes in, shows the big badge, and expects everybody to get out of the way and let them do their thing. The rhetoric has been heavy-handed. I mean, these two instances of people being killed, immediately the Secretary of Homeland Security is going, domestic terrorist and, casting these individuals in the worst possible light, whatever the facts may be or turn out to be, but, going right there immediately. And that's kind of been the general tone from the administration. So can you say, hey, look, this is like people are acting like they're sort of an invading force here, and they feel like there's an invading force there, and so is it reasonable to resist that and to want local law enforcement to be able to do their job without the stiff arm that they're receiving from the feds? Now, I don't think that's the whole story, right? That's kind of a caricature of the situation to put it in the best possible light, that resistance. But there's some truth to that, that I think if you were to emphasize that at the expense of some other facts on the ground, might lead you very much to have sympathy with those that are resisting ICE enforcement in Minneapolis or other places.
Well, their argument would have to be no enforcement, no federal enforcement without representation. And I think that gets you to the argument against this obstruction to ICE enforcement. Minnesota does have representation, and it has for years, and that there have been laws passed by the federal government, and we can go through, quickly what those laws are. You had in 1952 the Immigration and Nationality Act, and in that it's granted broad authority for immigration enforcement, including removal, arrest, detention, and questioning of non-citizens. So that's a law on the books that was passed 74 years ago. It's not something that was imposed administratively in the year 2026.
Right.
Additionally, you have the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996 that delegates certain immigration enforcement powers to train state, local law enforcement under federal supervision. And then, of course, you have the Homeland Security Act of 2002. So there have been laws that have been passed over the last 75 years pertaining to immigration. And if these laws have been passed in a lawful way through representation, and they're now being enforced, there's a law on the books that's being enforced. And if you're obstructing that enforcement of that law, then you're disrupting social order because you think that something is wrong. So yeah, I think that's the much stronger argument here. I know there are the optics of what you see on TV, et cetera, as to what's going on.
Mhm.
And it's hard, right? It's hard to get to a reasonable response to something that you don't like, because we live in a society where we're reactive, like it's my team against your team.
Right.
But what would be a reasonable response? And I think going back to the beginning of this episode, we see outliers that are not reasonable, tar and feathering, Stamp Act agents. It's not reasonable, but there's an effort, right, in that Declaration of Rights to be reasonable. So what would reason? How could reason prevail in our day, Matt?
Well, yeah, we have a pretty good model here. So, I mean, petitioning seems like such a very quaint idea, but actually that's the beginnings of how you build a political movement. You propose changes, you make a public case for them, you build a consensus around them, right? I mean, it takes work, shouting slogans and recording video on your phones. That's pretty fun, probably, and energizing. I can imagine what it's like to be part of a crowd like that, and just, the energy that comes with that. But there's no policy attached to that, right? ICE out isn't really a policy. You can't just say, well, we're not going to enforce immigration law. I mean, that was effectively the policy perhaps of the last administration, but that was why there's no second term for that administration, or why Kamala Harris was defeated in a large measure was because of an effort to stop enforcing the law. And look, by the way, those laws, the first two you mentioned, the two core laws here, one was passed during the Truman administration, one the Clinton administration. Those are Democratic administrations. So these are not like right-wing impositions upon the nation to establish, frameworks of unreasonable terms for immigration. This is just a basic protecting your borders, separating those that are here legally from those that are here illegally, and using appropriate means to respond to that. So, yeah, I mean, petition. You don't like the rules? Get the rules changed. The next majority can pass a law that changes things significantly if you can build a consensus around that. Protests, sure, have protests. Peaceful assemblies, right? That's right there in the First Amendment. You have a right to a peaceful assembly. Now, that's different from a riot. That's different from obstruction of justice. And so, you want to build a consensus behind your position, then okay, start to get people out there, but then also organize politically. Get candidates to run who advocate your position. Again, make the argument in the public square. Those are the ways that the American colonists began to build a movement. There wasn't a movement for independence in 1765. There were those that were concerned about where things were going. But over the course of time, as the back and forth went the way it went, and as we'll trace the story as it unfolds, you get to a point where a substantial group of Americans are ready to take more decisive action. You didn't get there overnight. It took some work politically. And if you think that American immigration law is unjust or its enforcement is misguided, do the work and persuade the American public, and you can make all kinds of changes.
I'll tell you what's not reasonable. Sanctuary cities are not reasonable. We're not going to abide by federal law in our city. You know that the colonists were willing to submit to legitimate authority, but they weren't going to nullify legitimate authority. I mean, could you imagine, for example, Matt, if I said, okay, well, we're in Colorado Springs, we're not paying federal taxes.
Right.
This is sanctuary city for people who don't want to pay federal taxes. I mean, how would that be perceived on the left? Where we've just stated, no, we know there's a federal law, we know that there's a tax system in place, but we're not going to abide by that law. And in fact, and this is something else that's not reasonable, we are going to violently interfere with the enforcement of that law. I mean, how would that be perceived center left?
Right.
It'd be perceived as one of those movements that was crazy.
Right. And that's one of the problems really throughout these kinds of discussions, or lack of discussion maybe, is that there's just an unwillingness to apply the principle more generally, right? You say, well, this is how we're going to behave here because we really are concerned about this issue. And we're going to have no thought about what that says as a general principle or the application of that by others in other contexts, because we are righteous here, they are unrighteous wherever they act, so we don't have to be bound by the same morality. But the underlying political reality is that's not how it works. Whatever precedent you set will be used by others, perhaps in ways you don't like, but perhaps in ways that are equally reasonable to yours. And so are we really committed to the idea that cities, counties, states can effectively secede, can deny the authority of federal law within their borders? I mean, that's we know about that. That's Calhoun, that's South Carolina, that's secession. We turned our back on that 150 years ago. Don't think we want to go back there.
Yeah. So what is the government's responsibility? We're talking about the responsibility that we have as Christians under the principles of Romans 13, that we have as people who may think that something is unjust. But in terms of the government actually carrying out its responsibility, what does that look like under the constitutional rule of law?
Well, this is kind of interesting because this is kind of our alternate history, right? What if the British had done things differently? What if they hadn't dug their heels in? What if they hadn't passed the Declaratory Act? What pathway forward might there have been to preserve good relations with the American colonists, let's say, well into the 19th century? So that's, eventually America's an independent country. It's too big not to be, too many people not to be, but it's like Canada in its relation with Great Britain, right? And rather than, two wars and all the conflict. Well, let's start by enforcing the law as appointed authorities that are serving a free people rather than as an occupying or a conquering force. And when those British soldiers come over and they invade Boston from the Bostonians' perspective, that's different from local law enforcement. So when ICE shows up in Minneapolis, it needs to be respecting the people there. These are free people that their salary is being paid by those taxpayers, among others, right? And so the disposition of the government should be, we are here to serve. Now, that can be require force, right? That can require confrontation. Doesn't, it's not just singing kumbaya, but there's nevertheless a disposition that comes with a right service mentality that doesn't treat parts of your country as if it's enemy territory.
That's it, and that's difficult in that situation, in that context. I mean, we've all seen these videos, right, where the hotels you're staying in, the windows are being broken, you got whistles,
Yeah,
horns all around you.
right,
You're being physically confronted by the group. So it's hard to go into that situation. All right, and blessed are the peacemakers, for they are the children of God. When you're
right.
getting rocks thrown at you and all the rest of this stuff. But I think your point also speaks to, I think, another part of the government's responsibility, that how can you be responsive to public sentiment and respectful of honorable dissent without, labeling the other an enemy? Because it's easy to get into this game of labeling the other. And because what you're saying, Matt, here is that what becomes most important is ideological purity rather than the rule of law.
Right. And there's a way to feel the burden of that opposition, to be, be personally insulted by the epithets. Right? There's no doubt people are put in very difficult situations. Again, some of that I think is the result of the tactics that have led to the deployments. And so if that rhetoric had been toned down at an earlier stage, it might not be quite so bad on the ground. But some of that is the reaction and overreaction of those on the left. So there's a lot of trouble here. And it's really calling for those who are in positions of authority to exercise a restraint that others may not. Right? This is also part of a Christian call, right? Our husbands aren't supposed to love their wives if their wives are lovable. They're supposed to love their wives as Christ loved the church. Right? Your calling to care for somebody is independent of how they've treated you. Now, it doesn't make it easy, right? We understand weakness. We understand the difficulty of following through on that principle. But government has a responsibility to its citizens, even when those citizens are annoying, even when those citizens are frustrating, even when those citizens are doing things they ought to be arrested for. But it's not a capital offense to cause trouble. It's not a capital offense to go a little too far in your protest. And so they
Yeah.
need to be able to exercise some measure of verbal and physical restraint, even in the face of provocation.
Well, we knew this was coming. I think when we talked about the election and the emphasis on immigration, and the very true fact that we have 20 million illegal immigrants in the country, and that's a very difficult public policy question. I mean, how do you change that situation so that you just don't become a place filled with illegal immigrants? It was going to be difficult, and you saw the kind of rebellious activity within the Vietnam War. You saw it once again during the George Floyd protests. So you knew this was coming, and there's an organized opposition
Right.
to what you're doing. So it's an incredibly difficult thing to carry out in with restraint, as you're saying, verbally and physically, and with those principles that we in our last series went through, kind of notion of equality, notion of responsibility, right? Honor, lawfulness, justice, and prudence. I mean, those are hard things to do on the ground. It's what we ought to do, but it's hard to do in the moment. So this is going to come up over and over again. I don't think this. So in the series over the next 6 months, we're gonna see the evolution of the American Revolution, and hopefully we'll see places where equality, honor, responsibility, all of those things are very much part of the actions that we take place.
Amen. All right, well, let's wrap up the show as we often do with Tocqueville's crystal ball. So I was a few weeks ago looking at the calendar and thinking, oh, well, there's only seven more football games, or there's only five more football games. Now there's only one. We've wrapped up college football. Dave, you were one Miami drive away from really nailing the championship game. Obviously, Indiana won the game 27-21, but you had Miami by one, and Indiana hung on to their credit. Amazing victory, amazing championship for them. Last time we also picked divisional playoffs. We both were right in picking the Patriots, and actually both right on the point spread as well. You had it as a bit of a bigger victory, which was correct. I had a 4 point victory for the Patriots, but the more important thing is now we're on to the Super Bowl, and we have the Patriots in the Super Bowl against the Seahawks, a rematch of old Super Bowl 49, which of course the Patriots won in fine style as Malcolm Butler made that incredible interception of Russell Wilson in the last seconds of the game. But this time around, Seattle 4.5 point favorite. Lots of buzz about Seattle's unstoppable defense. Dave, what do you make of it all, and what are your thoughts about how that Super Bowl is going to turn out?
Well, the headline news in political news is Minneapolis. The headline news in sports is Bill Belichick not being voted into the Hall of Fame on the
Yeah,
first ballot. There have always been Patriots haters. I think this works out perfectly for the New England Patriots, that the unjust keeping of Belichick from the Hall of Fame. It's interesting too. My wife's family, some of them are very, very far left, and they've tied like the injustice of Belichick cheating to the injustice of what's happening in Minneapolis. It's like it's crazy, crazy stuff. But I think it's Patriots have had a great season. Yes, they've had some advantages along the way, but there's something special happening in New England. There is a certain Belichickian discipline that is in place in Vrabel's regime, albeit with a smile, with a hug,
yeah,
with a handshake that we never saw from him. So I think this thing is going to move forward. I think that New England wins, not only wins, but wins by a pretty good margin. I would say more than two touchdowns. My rationale for that is that the Patriots offense hasn't played well. They played hard defenses the last 3 weeks. But I'm going to argue that Josh McDaniels, the offensive coordinator of the Patriots, and Drake May, they get their mojo back. That on defense, that Sam Darnold sees ghosts enough times to create costly turnovers. We convert those turnovers into touchdowns, yeah, and we win 35-20. So we have to be better in the red zone. We want touchdowns, not field goals,
yeah.
and I think that's the key to the game. No turnover, win the turnover battle, and get touchdowns, not field goals.
Okay, yeah. Well, that would be amazing. That would be, I think, the biggest win in a Super Bowl, right? I mean, they've all been pretty much one score games. I mean, I think the Patriots single-handedly brought back the decent Super Bowl.
Exactly.
The wins and losses were all really, really good games after so many terrible Super Bowls in the 80s and 90s. I'm going to take the tradition. I'm going to say Patriots win 23-21. Last second field goal. Speaking of ghosts, Adam Vinatieri, ghost of Adam Vinatieri is a new rookie kicker, steps up 47 yards as time expires. Patriots win by two. So I've got a lot of field goals in 23. I guess that's three field goals and a couple touchdowns, but they get enough points on the board to win, and seven championships separates them from the pack. 12 Super Bowls, of course, already the standard, and the Patriots dynasty rolls on.
Greatest sports franchise of the 21st century.
There you go. Be a beautiful thing. Well, we'll see what happens. We've got a couple weeks to see it all sort itself out, and we'll be back, Lord willing, in 2 weeks as we take our next steps toward July 4th, 1776, and July 4th, 2026. Thanks as always for being with us. You can follow us on Instagram and YouTube or email us at democracyinamericatoday@gmail.com. We'll talk again soon.
2020 vision.